I knew things weren't as they seemed when I arrived at my parents' house. We were all gathering for a family dinner, but something was wrong. My suspicions were confirmed when I opened my car door and heard my son and my father arguing. "Damn it, Gramps, this isn't right. Watch your mouth, boy. Remember whose house you're in." "I don't give a shit whose house it is. I'm not going to be a part of this." "Bradley," my mother called out. Brad bolted out the front door and froze in front of me. There was still a scowl on his face, but his eyes widened with surprise. "Dad, I'm sorry, I wasn't a part of this." "What?" I said, fighting the foreboding sensation building in my stomach. We turned and watched together as the trio filed out onto the porch. My parents stood there with my fiancée, Karen. Each face told a different story. My father bore his typical emotionless stone face, while my mother harbored a look of determination. Karen's face showcased a mixture of fear and concern. "This isn't right," Brad shouted back at them before shaking his head in disgust and turning back towards me. "Run, Dad. It's a trap," he said flatly. "Mom is in there." I felt my stomach sour, and I'm sure I let out an audible groan. The thought of a confrontation with my ex-wife, even after 2 years, still made me ill. I didn't have the anger and bitterness I'd once had towards her, but the fallout during the divorce had caused me to try to erase her from my life. I'd only spoken to her twice after I learned about her cheating. The first was the night I left, and the second was shortly after she'd been served with the divorce papers. I watched silently as my son walked over to his car, got in, and quickly drove away. Turning, I stared at the instigators of my intervention. Surprisingly, I felt at peace. I'd fought against this and my feelings about it weren't in doubt, but others felt I needed this. Their trap had been sprung, their choices had been made, and regardless of intent, there would now be consequences. However that would occur in the future, now I needed to face my immediate situation. In an abstract way, it was like skydiving, like jumping, or possibly being thrown out of a plane. A person can scream and cry, pray, or piss themselves, but they're still going to fall. As long as their chute opens, they'll probably survive the experience. It was that kind of gallows wisdom which had me calmly assessing my current situation as what occurs during many life-threatening moments in life. My life flashed before my eyes. Unfortunately, I didn't get to revel in the good times and eventually ended up focusing on the last few years and Kathy. We'd had a good 26-year marriage, not great, but certainly not bad. We'd met in college, got married, graduated, got jobs, had 3 kids, bought cars and a house, the suburban dream. Looking back, if there were signs of our impending crash, I never saw them. Kathy and I would never be mistaken for some of the beautiful people, and were never considered part of the popular crowd. We're pretty average. I'm sort of tall but thin. At 6'2" and 170 pounds, I'm even considered scrawny by some. My curly black hair and larger nose indicate my Mediterranean heritage. My black glasses and pocket protector identify me as a nerd, engineer. Kathy looks like she stepped out of a Harry Potter fan convention. A tall, thin, geeky librarian. She's 5'11" and only weighs 130 pounds. She has always had long, straight brown hair, and her large rimmed glasses seem to magnify her dark brown eyes. Even though she wasn't some model, I'd always loved her long body. I thought she was beautiful, and until that day she was the woman of my dreams. I won't say everything was perfect at home. We argued, usually about money. We were doing well with me as an engineer and Kathy as a technical writer for a large local corporation, but we'd had some high-dollar expenditures over the past decade. Buying a new home, putting 3 kids through college, and paying for 2 weddings had left us financially tight at times. Other than the new home, I wouldn't have changed a thing. I guess I was expecting something different when we finally became empty nesters. We were both 47 years old, in good health, had decent jobs, a house, and our sex life wasn't too bad. It was pretty conservative, but we got together at least once a week. Our love life was, however, a bit more hit and miss. I tried to keep the romantic fires burning, but it was a challenge. We tried to commit to a date night once a week, but with our jobs and other distractions, it was more like once a month. After our youngest child, Brad, left for college, Kathy poured herself into her job. She was already highly thought of within her company, but with her new intensity, she was quickly given the lead on a huge corporate project. She headed up a large team to rewrite the training materials for the corporation. The amount of time she spent at work soon replaced money as the biggest contention in our marriage. I was proud of her, but the zeal she dove into her project sometimes scared me. It seemed her job had become the main priority in her life. 15 months later, she completed the project to great accolades from upper management. She and her team had done such a great job, they were up for some national awards with both the National Technical Writers Association and the professional association her company belonged to. I went to see her receive her award at the National Tech Writers Conference. I was extremely proud of her, even though the project had monopolized her time over the past year. Kathy beamed as she basked in her night of recognition. The Corporations Association annual conference was a month later and was a circus. It was huge compared to the previous conference, since tech writing was only one of several categories being recognized. Kathy's team was so large her company agreed to pay traveling expenses for each employee, but not for the spouses. I'd used up most of my vacation leave and we'd already splurged on the previous conference, so Kathy went to this one by herself. She roomed with another woman from her office. It wasn't a big deal since she'd gone to conferences without me over the years, but had I known what would happen during those 4 days in Chicago, I would have found a way to have been there. As they say, hindsight is 20/20. I hadn't even realized my marriage had been gutted at that time. Kathy had come back ill. She'd said she'd caught some type of flu bug and gotten sick the last night there. Thankfully, it wasn't at the awards banquet, but it had happened at the reception party afterwards. She'd drunk quite a bit at the reception and had gotten very sick. At least that's what I believed for 3 months until I received an unexpected visit. Mrs. Jordan was a very well-dressed, attractive woman in her early 60s. She was also the wife of Thomas Jordan, vice president of Kathy's division at work. I'd met him a few times at corporate functions. He was a distinguished-looking, trim man in his late 50s with salt and pepper hair. He'd always hit me as somewhat arrogant, but I couldn't tell if that was his personality or simply a byproduct of his position. My meeting with his wife was very enlightening. Apparently, Mr. Jordan had always had an eye for the ladies. She'd caught him in an affair earlier in their marriage, but they'd reconciled. She believed he'd remained faithful after that until 2 years ago. Then the lies and suspicion had begun again. 6 months ago, she'd had enough. Mrs. Jordan had hired someone to get evidence for her impending divorce. She told me she had proof of his long-time affair, however, it wasn't with Kathy. Unfortunately, she also had evidence of his night with my wife in Chicago. It appeared to be a one-night stand, but she couldn't be sure. She'd stopped the investigation shortly after the Chicago trip since she had what she needed for the divorce. The pictures she handed me of my wife and her husband were enough to make my heart quit beating. They showed my wife and her VP dirty dancing in the ballroom. There were photos of them making out and even a few of Jordan with his hands under my wife's little black dress with an expression of pure lust and ecstasy written across Kathy's face. There was also a set of them sneaking into one of the hotel restrooms. Several minutes later, they exited and it was obvious Kathy's dress had been straightened and her makeup reapplied. Her face was flushed, and she'd what is commonly referred to as a freshly screwed look. The final set of photos showed them draped together as they entered his hotel room. Although none were overly explicit, there was no doubt of what had occurred on the last night of the conference. Mrs. Jordan left me copies of her report and pictures. I knew immediately that my marriage was over. Could I have gotten past a one-time mistake? Doubtful, but I guess it was possible. Whatever trust one might have still had, though, was now gone. Her betrayal and hiding it from me those past months was as damaging to our marriage as her cheating. That night when I got home, Kathy was working late again. I wondered if she was actually working or was getting together with Jordan or some other workmate behind those protective office doors. That's the thing, isn't it? Once trust is destroyed, it's a pain in the butt to ever regain it. Most times it never comes back, and if it does, it's never as strong as it once was. The poison of doubt insidiously creeps into every area, making you question every action, past and present. Things that were once thought of as simply innocent were now looked on with suspicion. I was partially packed by the time Kathy got home. I'd left copies of the most incriminating photos on the table. When I came out of the bedroom with my suitcases, I saw her sitting dejectedly in the kitchen. She looked up at me with tears in her eyes. "Billy," she said softly, "I'm sorry. Not sorry enough to be honest with me though, right?" I sneered. "Would you've ever told me?" "No," she whispered as a tear rolled down her cheek. I slammed the door as I left. She was served divorce papers 4 days later. She tried to call me several times those first few days, but I'd been extremely rude. I told her there wasn't anything she could say to change things and to never contact me again. Was that extreme? Certainly, but I was in pain, a pain she'd caused, so her feelings meant nothing at that time. I didn't start out trying to purge Kathy out of my life. I needed time away from her to think during those first several weeks. I was hurting and angry, but I was still struggling with whether or not to go through with the divorce. For all I knew, it was a one-time thing. But even if it was, The trust we'd once had was gone. I didn't know if I could live with the type of marriage that would have remained. Of course, my friends and family all had their opinions. Some thought I should dump her, but most felt I should try and reconcile since we put so many years into it. My parents were the most vocal. I thought hard about it, but in the end decided I needed to move on. It wasn't a popular decision. The barrage of disapprovals from my parents, children, and friends was overwhelming. I soon found myself constantly defending my decision while facing a long string of people trying to talk me into giving Kathy another chance. The constant questioning of why couldn't I forgive her was matched by my constant retort of why, if she loved me so much, couldn't she keep her legs together? Seemed like every discussion turned into a debate. I soon grew tired and annoyed that I was being treated as if it was my fault we were getting a divorce, and I told them all that Kathy and my divorce was a dead issue. I loudly stated I wouldn't have anything to do with any conversation or individuals who couldn't honor that. Some understood my decision, many didn't. The confrontations with those who didn't were sometimes ugly. When she was mentioned, I simply got up and left, quietly if I was allowed, loud and rudely if I wasn't. Unsurprisingly, publicly telling supposed friends that since it was forgivable and not a marriage killer, could I borrow their wives for a weekend of just sex didn't go over well. Neither did telling them I was moving on, and if it offended them, then they could shove it up their butts. I lost several friends during that time. My kids were grudgingly supportive after my decision, even though I knew they hoped there was some way their parents' marriage could survive. They were appalled and angry with their mother, but didn't abandon her. I tried not to make them take sides. I did, however, make it clear they weren't to talk to me about her. While my kids honored my wishes towards their mother, my parents didn't. My mother liked Kathy and couldn't live with the fact we were getting a divorce. I got my Greek heritage from her. She's more than a little pushy and tends to dismiss opinions which don't match her own. My father is a different type of pushy. He was a drill sergeant in the Army for 20 years. He's been referred to as an a-hole countless times, but that's being kind. There are far worse words that are closer to the truth. Individually, they can be difficult to deal with but can be handled. Whenever they're both in agreement, they are a force of nature. Apparently, my divorcing my cheating ex-wife was considered unnatural because they bombarded me with their advice. They constantly reminded me of my responsibilities and commitments, regardless of Kathy's actions. After the fifth shouting match, things finally came to a head and they finally got the message. Kathy was off limits. Unfortunately, it took threatening to sever all relations with them if they ever brought her, or my soon-to-be divorce, up again. I knew this would get their attention. Since I'm the sole remaining child they still had any regular contact with. My oldest brother had died in an accident 20 years earlier. He'd been unmarried and left no children behind. My two older sisters, Rose and Monica, were a different matter. Both had been driven away by my parents' constant interference in their marriages and families. Neither of them had spoken to my parents more than a few times in over a decade, so when I delivered my ultimatum, my parents grudgingly agreed. Of course, I did have one more final meeting with Kathy. A face-to-face meeting had been her only demand before she'd signed the divorce papers. I agreed, knowing it was going to be painful. It was. "Bill, I'm sorry," she said softly. "I know it doesn't change things, but I wanted you to know it only happened that one time. I realize you don't have to believe me, but it's true." "You're right, Kathy," I replied coldly. "It doesn't change anything, and I really don't have to believe you. As a matter of fact, why would I?" I saw my words strike home, even though she maintained her stoic facade. "I'll give her credit, though," she continued on undaunted. "I'd like to say I was drunk, but I wasn't so drunk that I couldn't have stopped it." "Then why?" She sighed deeply. "That's something I wish I could easily answer, for both our sakes. It wasn't exactly that I wasn't being fulfilled at home. Well, I guess that's not completely true, is it? If I was getting everything I needed from you, I wouldn't have fallen so easily. So this is my fault?" I snapped. "No," she cried, momentarily losing her composure. "Oh God, please don't think that. What I meant was you couldn't give me what I was wanting. No one could. I wanted, needed, your love and support, but I also needed to achieve success on my own and receive validation from others. So no, you couldn't give me everything I wanted. No one person could. It was my pride which allowed me to fall, my steadfast belief I had control of the situation. When we received our award, I got so wrapped up in celebrating my recognition that I got careless. I thought I had it so together I was invincible. How is that for being arrogant? When Mr. Jordan began heaping praise after praise on me, I relished it. I was the center of attention and had people congratulating me everywhere I turned. Between that and the drinks, I got careless and got swept away in the moment. When he led me up to his hotel room, I knew what was about to happen. I'll go to my grave regretting I didn't stop it earlier. I can't tell you exactly why I gave in and walked into his room. I can tell you I knew I'd already crossed too many lines and was already guilty of betraying you. There were my actions at the party, the teasing and groping, the passionate kissing, and allowing him to feel me up in a hotel bathroom. Her voice broke. She turned away and wiped her eyes. Turning back towards me, she gathered herself and continued. After it happened, I was devastated. I went into his bathroom and hid until he left. I looked into the mirror and saw a faithless 304 looking back at me. My guilt lay in front of me with no way to hide it from my eyes. I saw my world slowly sliding over the edge of a cliff. I fully realized I was the one who pushed it, but I was now frantically trying to find a way to stop it. I know it doesn't look like it, but I love you, Bill, and I need your love. It's your love and support that is the foundation I built my life on. I realized when I returned home after the conference that there was no scenario I could come up with which included confessing to you and saving our marriage. We'd both made it very clear throughout our marriage that cheating was a deal breaker and would end the marriage. I decided not to tell you. My reasons were selfish, but also practical. Just so you wouldn't lose anything, right? I sneered. Her face looked like I'd hit her. My hurt and anger was starting to boil over, and I wasn't even trying to hide my feelings. I said my reasoning was selfish, she said softly. I also knew nothing good would come from confessing. I would never put myself in a situation like that ever again. It was a one-time mistake I'd make sure never happened again. I didn't resign or put in for a transfer because I rarely came into contact with Mr. Jordan other than a weekly status meeting. Besides, if I had, you would have gotten suspicious and started asking questions. You're smart and would have begun to suspect something had happened in Chicago that you wouldn't have liked. Billy, I love you whether you believe me or not. The thought of seeing you hurt and in pain because of my actions was more than I believed I could handle. My guilt was overwhelming and was more than enough for both of us. I made the decision to bear my shame silently for the rest of my life. I prayed I'd be given a second chance. I swore to heaven and any other deity listening I'd never fall like that again, and given the opportunity, I'd be the best wife you could ever ask for. Obviously, it didn't turn out that way. Perhaps, I said coldly, they remembered those were the same vows you made on our wedding day. And perhaps they knew, like I do now, your promises are worthless. She stared at me silently, her eyes pleading. She hoped, as I did, there was a way to put back together something which was shattered. Unfortunately, we both knew it was too late. Kathy signed the divorce papers after the meeting. They were fair and close to what the courts probably would have determined. Afterwards, I had no more contact with her. A few months later, our divorce was final and I found myself trying to move on. My children, Kathy, Mary, and Brad, all helped me through that first year after the divorce. I wasn't as bad as I'd been during the divorce, but I was still bitter and caustic. I knew they were also there for their mother, but I never asked, and they were good enough not to offer any information. My relationship with my parents was another matter. It was strained, at best. The ghost of my failed marriage seemed to be present every time we talked. I'm not sure how long it would have gone on like that, but then something changed. They met my fiancé. I hadn't started dating again until several months after the divorce. It was bad. I'm not sure what I expected, but most of the women I dated had as much baggage as I did. I'm sure those women that didn't have so much baggage couldn't wait for our dates to end, since my bitterness probably ruined their evenings. I plodded along like that for about 7 months before I met Karen. She changed my world. Karen was a small, curvy bundle of joy. Her dark brunette mane framed her pretty face and huge, toothy smile. She was barely over 5 foot tall and carried about 30 extra pounds. Fortunately, a lot of it was in her hips. She'd been divorced for about 9 years when I met her. She'd come out of a very abusive marriage. Her only child, a son, unfortunately followed in his abusive father's footsteps and had left for parts unknown 3 years before we started dating. Saying that hidden behind her happy, bubbly facade was a scared woman with massive trust issues would have been a huge understatement. When I took her to meet my parents, I wasn't sure how they'd react. I should have never doubted Karen's ability to endear herself to others. She simply had that way about her. Where they liked Kathy, they absolutely adored Karen. She was adopted into the family after only the second time meeting them. Karen certainly wasn't perfect and her trust issues were a big problem, as were mine. But she breathed life into my dead existence and I fell for her. I fell for her hard. When I asked her to marry me, she agreed with a few stipulations, since we'd only been dating seriously for about 6 months. The first stipulation was that our engagement would be at least a year long to make sure we weren't rushing things. The second stipulation sucked. We were going to both get counseling, so as not to drag the baggage from our past marriages into our new one. We started couples counseling a month later. Lots of ugly little things were exposed on both sides. For the most part, we were working through them. There was one Karen struggled a lot with. It was the fact I refused to talk to my ex-wife. I had been very open with Karen about my marriage and divorce. By that time, I could talk about it without getting angry or sad. I realized Karen was concerned I might still have feelings for Kathy because I did. After 20-plus years of marriage, those feelings don't simply disappear overnight. Of course, they had now changed, morphed from what they'd once been. The love I'd once had for Kathy had been poisoned with anger and bitterness. Any love that remained was now so diluted it would never threaten my love for Karen. I couldn't see any benefit of digging up the past and revisiting the pain surrounding my divorce. Apparently, my thoughts and feelings on the matter were about to be overridden. "Well, son," my father growled, "are you going to grow a pair? Or are you going to run away like a coward?" "Please, Will," Karen pleaded. "Talk to her." I nodded sadly and sighed. Silently, I stepped up on the porch. My mother went to hug me and I stepped back. "Don't touch me," I said coldly. I saw the pain in her face as the recognition of what her treachery might cost her began to dawn on her. I also noticed the look of horror Karen had on her face when she stepped forward, and I shook my head. "Great," my father sneered. "Are you going to throw a temper tantrum too?" "Screw you, old man." I snapped back at him. "And one more shitty comment from you and I'll leave." "So, anything else you want to say, a-hole?" My father's face turned bright red and the veins in his neck bulged. I wasn't sure if he was going to have a stroke right then and there. We'd had countless shouting matches, but I'd never verbally attacked him like that before. He clenched his fists, and I thought he might actually take a swing at me. He was still in decent shape, but at 75 it wouldn't have been a fair fight. The sad truth was things had gotten to the point where I would have hit my elderly father. What a sad state of affairs, I conceded to myself. Maybe it's really time to walk away and start over. Amazingly, he didn't do or say anything else. I walked past him and into the house. The looks and smells caused the memories to immediately wash over me. This had been my parents' home ever since my brother had died. The furniture, the carpet, the walls, everything permeated the essence of my parents. It was my second home. I felt a deep sadness as I realized I might never walk into this place again. My thoughts were abruptly interrupted when I saw her sitting in the living room. She stood up and I noticed she'd lost more weight than she should have. She looked tired and her weary smile looked like it was forced. Even with all that, I still saw the woman I'd fallen in love with all those years ago. The pain I still felt must have been written on my face since I watched her smile dissolve. "I'm sorry, Billy," she said softly. "I told them this was a very bad idea, but they wouldn't listen." She snorted and tried to hide a small smirk. "Not like your parents have ever listened." It was my turn to smirk. There was a great deal of truth in that statement. I felt the cold rage at their betrayal beginning to build in my mind. I hadn't realized it, but Kathy's reaction told me I wasn't hiding my dark thoughts. They really crossed a line this time, didn't they? I nodded. "Past the point of no return?" she asked quietly. "I don't know, but I think so." "I'm sorry." I tried to tell them, but I think they believed it was necessary if you and Karen were to have a future together. "Bill, even though they're a pain in the butt, they really do love you." For her part, so does Karen, but not enough to respect my wishes, right? I snapped. Whether they thought my decision was childish, just being stubborn, or simply wrong, it was my decision, not theirs. It shows the lack of respect they have for me. At least the kids weren't a part of all this, although I'm a little surprised you are. Well, I know both Kathy and Mary told them they wouldn't be. Both said they told all three this was a very bad idea and begged them not to do this. Brad was wrapped up in a major class project in school, and apparently didn't realize what was happening. It's not surprising since he's completely focused on schoolwork and trying to graduate at the end of the semester. As for me, well, it's simple. I looked at the woman who had been my world for over 2 decades and saw her shift uncomfortably. There was a deep sadness about her she'd never had while we were married. For some reason, it didn't give me the satisfaction I would have thought it would. "Bill," she said with a sad smile, "whatever I say and however you react to what I've to say won't make things worse between us. I've already lost you. You already hate me, so I've got nothing more to lose. When your parents asked me to do this, I initially turned them down. Even though I had nothing to lose, I wasn't interested in causing you any more pain. Then Karen visited me, and we had a long talk. She asked me to at least speak to you. I told her what I planned on saying to you, and even though she didn't like it, she agreed I needed to be honest. I told her she was playing with fire, and regardless of whatever I said or however you reacted to it, she could still easily lose you. I'm sorry to say she still needed to do this. She really does love you, but she's terrified you still have strong feelings towards me. It's fear, plain and simple. The kids have told me a little about her and her past, and I'm sure that's where most of this is coming from. We both stood looking at each other, wrapped in an awkward silence. Finally, I sighed deeply. All right, Kathy, I resigned. Say what you need to say. How do we do this? Billy, she said softly, would you please walk with me in the backyard? I nodded silently, trying not to betray my feelings. We silently strolled around in my parents' huge backyard away from prying ears. She broke the silence with a whisper. I'm sorry, Bill, you didn't deserve this. And now, she sighed sadly, now I'm going to make things more complicated. She smiled weakly at my surprise. Bill, I've been a fool, in so many ways. I knew I'd lost you when I'd slept with Mr. Jordan, but I never really tried to show you how sorry I was. I saw the futility in it, so I never tried, but I was wrong. When we separated, I felt so guilty I tried to honor your wishes that we not have any communication. I did it mainly so you could have breathing room to try and figure out what you needed to do. Unfortunately, it didn't work out that way. I knew there were many of our friends and family who approached you about divorcing me. I tried to discourage it, but I think I came off as being the repentant sinner and made it worse. Oh, I was genuinely repentant, and I would have done anything to have taken back my stupidity and save our marriage, but my remorse seemed to spur on your parents and some of our friends. I'm sorry they made you feel like you had to put up a wall and never talk to me again. That's where I was wrong. I stared at her silently for a few seconds. My confusion was evident, and she smiled sadly. Even though I was trying to give you space, I failed to do one of the things which would have helped us both heal afterwards. Whether it was hopeless or not, I should have done something, anything to have shown you how much you still meant to me. I started to say something, but she interjected. I know it wouldn't have stopped the divorce, but it might have helped us heal better in the aftermath. I would have put actions where my words were so you would have seen I was truly sorry, and I would have had some peace knowing that at least I tried to show you. I can't tell you how much I regretted not doing that. There were so many times I started to call you and set up a meeting where I could at least try to talk to you, but you'd cut all communication with me. I floundered around for months trying to figure out a way to approach you, but then you met Karen. The kids told me a little bit about her and how she was affecting you. I can't tell you I wasn't jealous, but I realized then you'd moved on. I tried to move on as well. I wasn't as successful as you were. Part of my problem was I needed closure with you. I needed to say some things to you, but I didn't really know how. Then this opportunity came along and I was given a second chance to at least rectify that mistake, even if I can't change any of the others. So, Bill, she gently took my hand. Looking up at me, the tears began to fill her eyes as she began to release some of the pain and frustration which had been buried for so long. My husband, she said softly, and to me you'll always be my husband. I am so sorry. I can't imagine the disappointment and pain I've caused you. I'm ashamed of my actions and how they've ruined the most precious thing in my life, my marriage to you. And yes, it was the most precious thing, but I took my eyes off of guarding it. Instead of protecting it, I took it for granted and looked only at myself. In doing so, I allowed it to be poisoned. In one evening, I destroyed our family. I destroyed our future. Because of me, our children have had to split their time between their mother and father instead of simply enjoying us as a family. I struggled to wrap my brain around what I was hearing. If I thought my mind was in chaos, it was nothing compared to my heart. What do you want, Kathy? What are you hoping for? What I want is a chance to be back in your life. What I hope is this little stunt they pulled will make you question if Karen is the one you want to spend the rest of your life with. You think I'll dump Karen and take you back? She smiled. I won't lie and tell you it doesn't sound good to me, but I know it can't happen like that. I know you and I know this little stunt has hurt your relationship with Karen more than she imagines it will. What I hope is that after this, your relationship with her isn't exclusive. I'm praying you begin dating other women again, and you allow me to be one of them. Billy, I'm sorry for this ambush, not for me, because I finally get to bare my soul, but for you. Whatever you decide to do, please make sure you do it for you and not for anyone else. I know you've got a lot to think through, so I'll leave you in peace. I love you, Bill. Whatever you decide, I'm afraid I always will to some degree. She gently touched my arm as she walked past me. I looked into her eyes and saw a tired sadness in them, mixed with relief. I felt the same weariness, but not the relief. I sat down on a patio bench, overwhelmed by Kathy's confession and proposition. After this much time, I questioned myself if there could ever be any type of relationship with my ex-wife, or even if I wanted one. I heard the patio door open and felt her cautiously approach me. Her timid voice forced my mind to focus back on my fiancée, the woman who claimed she loved me. Will? I didn't look up. I was struggling to keep my thoughts and emotions separate, in fear they would ignite. Will, are we okay? No, I said quietly, and the fact you have to ask says a lot about our relationship. I know, she said, holding back a sob. I'm sorry. Problem is you're not sorry enough not to have done this to me. Even now, you do this to me again, right? I'm sorry, Will, she said softly and sobbed. But I needed so badly to know that. I know, I interrupted, that I loved you more than my ex-wife even though I've countlessly told you that very thing. I guess actions speak louder than words, right? We were both silent for several moments, struggling to say what was needed. I finally sighed deeply and looked at her. I'm sorry, Karen, I said softly. I tried to give you every reason to trust me, but you can't. I guess the fear and doubt from your past is so strong you're not able to. No, she cried out. That's not true. You've showed me today I can trust you. You did something very hard and painful and you did it for us. No, I sighed. I did it for you. All those earlier things, like couples counseling, those I did for us, but today was entirely for you. So, you now telling me I passed some type of test is all well and good, but I have to ask, at what cost? I'm sorry, Will. I needed to know for certain. That's the problem. You needed, but what about my needs? Karen, you're not the only one with trust issues. You say you can now trust me, but now it's evident I can't trust you. If I passed my test, then you failed yours. Today, your fears and insecurities overrode your supposed love for me. So what happens next week when something makes you doubt me, or even us? What hoops will I have to jump through just to win your trust again? Karen, I said softly, I can't live like that. I'm not strong enough to carry that load by myself, even for a little while. Maybe I'll be able to in the future, but not right now. Will, please, I'm so sorry, she said, her voice wavering. Forgive me? Of course I forgive you, I said calmly, but you knew I would, didn't you? You probably even counted on it to justify your actions. She nodded slightly and lowered her head sheepishly. But things are different now, aren't they? She whispered. I nodded. So where does that leave us? I sat there silently. I was tired, beyond tired. I was exhausted. I didn't want to be angry anymore. I didn't want to be betrayed anymore either. I don't know. I know the engagement is off, but whether we still date is up to you. Will, that's not fair. I know I hurt you. No, I don't think you do, I snapped. Maybe if I contacted your ex-husband and son and set up a surprise weekend getaway for just the three of you. Of course, I wouldn't tell you about it until you got there. Then you could get over any issues you still had with them. I looked into her eyes and saw a flash of realization begin to dawn. Her tears soon followed. Naturally, afterwards I would tell you it was for your own good, and then remind you how proud I was of you for facing your demons. Maybe then you'd get an idea of how hurt I am. Her tears were now flowing freely. I was surprised I didn't have the desire to rush to her aid. I suppose I was still numb. I'm so very sorry, she sobbed quietly. Me too, I sighed. Now we'll have to start all over again. Do you still love me? She weakly asked. Yes, I think so. To be honest, I'm not sure what to think right now. I know I still care for you, but things have changed and I'm not sure in what ways. You know I love you, right? That's probably a bad question to ask me right now, but yes, I believe you love me as much as you're able to right now. As much as I'm able to, she asked softly. I nodded. But that's not enough, is it? I'd be lying if I said it was. Maybe someday our love will grow stronger, if it's what we both want. But in the meantime, we'll go back to just dating? I sighed. I think that would be best. So will you be dating her as well? Kathy? I don't know. Maybe. I'd never even considered it before, and certainly not while we were together. I guess with things the way they are now, I'll need to decide what to do about her. Look, Karen, I'm really tired. I need to go home and pack a few things. Fortunately, I still have my apartment, so I'll be staying there until we figure all this out. I'll call you in a few days, and we can decide where we go from here. I stood up and took her in my arms. I could feel the wetness of her tears on my chest. I kissed her on top of the head, pulled away, and then I kissed her gently on the lips. Goodbye, Karen, I said, and went back into my parents' house. I knew I needed to say something to them. Closure is what Kathy had called it. My mind was racing, but I could still hear the gentle sobbing of my ex-fiancée behind me. I found both of my parents in the kitchen. Their looks told me what to expect. My mother had a worried but determined look, while my father appeared to be barely controlling his anger. It would mean my mother would try to justify their actions while my father would tell me to just get over it. It was a routine they'd used most of my life. Unfortunately, it was about to come to an end. Well, my mother started. That wasn't so bad now, was it? Depends on your perspective, I guess, I said calmly. For mine, it was extremely painful. Sometimes doing the right thing hurts. My father growled. You know that. Yeah, I sighed. That's what makes this so hard. Not only was it very difficult to talk to Kathy, it was even more painful to be stabbed in the back by those I used to trust. It won't happen again. Oh, no, honey, it wasn't like that. My mother began. Of course it was. I interjected. I told you no, but you just had to do it anyway. Regardless of my wishes or that it was my decision, you decided what you thought was best should be crammed down my throat. But as I said, it won't happen again. I would have thought you two would have learned something when you drove Rose and Monica away, but I guess not. You either can't or won't stop. So, like with my sisters, this is goodbye. I'm very sorry you won't have any of your children around you during your old age, but that's the price one pays for bullying and continuously trying to manipulate them, I guess. Don't you threaten us, boy, my father snapped. Not a threat, I snapped back. I'm simply ending this. If it'll make you feel better, I'll send a card once in a while. Until then, don't try to call or contact me. I won't respond. With that, I turned and walked out of my parents' house for what I suspected would be the last time. Behind me, I could hear my mother's pleading and weeping being drowned out by my father's cussing and yelling. This circus of an intervention was finally over. I'd like to say things calmed down afterwards, but it wouldn't be true. I severed all contact with my parents, even canceling my landline and getting a different cell number. Of course, it didn't stop them from trying to corner me at home or at work. It also didn't help that during the several times I went out with Karen again, my relationship with my parents became a major discussion topic each time. It wasn't the only reason we stopped dating, but it was a factor. It became painfully obvious to both of us that whatever we'd had was slowly dying. In the end, she wasn't emotionally healthy enough to help me overcome my distrust of her. It wasn't malicious, but it was what it was. Our final breakup was mutually anticipated. Afterwards, I decided I needed to make a clean break. I tried to get transferred, but my company wasn't some global corporation, so there were only a couple of options, and those weren't available. I applied and accepted a similar position, at a much lower salary, a couple of states away. I did meet with Kathy once before I left. I'd met her and Brad for lunch and informed them of my impending departure. They weren't thrilled with the news, but neither was surprised. My parents had been bombarding our children. Our daughters were far enough away, so they avoided the mess by simply blocking specific phone numbers. Brad wasn't as lucky. When we'd met, he told me he was frustrated they were forcing him to make those types of decisions. I understood, but my heart still went out to him. I hadn't wanted to put my son in that position, but I'm not sure circumstances would have allowed otherwise. He finally ended up breaking off contact with them as well. Before I left, Kathy asked if I'd given any thought to her proposition, and I told her I had. I asked her if I could call on her whenever I was back in town. She smiled and said she hoped I would. I got out of town without much fanfare and found myself starting to settle into my surroundings. It had been a couple months, and I was enjoying my new job even though money was tight. I'd even gone out on several dates, although those hadn't shown any real promise of being anything more than one-night stands. There were two I was going out with again. Celia was an attractive woman I'd met at work. She was several years older than I was, but in great shape since she was really into yoga. Lori was a cute little blonde divorcee who was in her early 40s. She was very overweight, but had the most beautiful blue eyes and pretty face. I was sitting back with a glass of wine, considering my current dating status when I heard the knock on my apartment door. When I answered it, I knew things were going to change again. "Hi," she said softly. "I was wondering if I might intrude on you a little. I'm considering renting one of the apartments in this complex, but I wanted to talk to some of the current residents first. Mind if I come in?" She didn't have the body or looks that would stop traffic, but she made my heart skip a beat. She was a tall, thin brunette, her hair shoulder length with gold frosted tips. Her large gold wire-framed glasses made her eyes look larger than they were. They also magnified the ever-changing looks of hope and determination, doubt and fear that danced in her eyes. "Kathy," I said softly, "what are you doing here?" Well, after my big speech about putting my actions where my mouth was, I thought it would be hypocritical of me not to try and show you I still care very much about you. And you did sort of ask me out before you left? Kathy, I asked if I could call on you when I got back into town. Yes, but you didn't come back quickly enough, she said with a sheepish grin. Billy, she said with her voice thick with emotion, I'm trying to find a balance. On one hand, I want to give you space to start over, but on the other, I need to make sure you know how much I want the chance to show you we can still have some type of future. I realize I'm not doing a good job of balancing, and I'm probably already borderline stalking you, but I needed you to know. If you want, I'd like to start over as well. I know our marriage is dead, but I believe we still have feelings for each other. I'd like to see where we might go if we started dating again. Kathy, moving into my apartment complex. Well, that was a line. Oh, I'd be very open to renting here, but I figured it might bother you, me being so close. I'm actually staying at a local motel right now. I interviewed for a position in the area this morning. The position is solid even if it is a level lower than where I currently am, but it looks like I should regain that level within a year or two. They offered me the job, but I told them to give me a couple days since I needed to talk to you first. I lost my input in your decisions when we divorced. Actually, I lost it before then. Her face pinched slightly and she looked away. Turning back, she stared directly into my eyes. You're right, of course, but I'm trying to change that. If you don't want me here, I'll go and won't bother you again. Listen, Billy, I'm trying to start over again, too. I started by changing my look slightly and am planning to move. Regardless of what you decide, I needed to get away from the past and begin again. I've got 3 other interviews in other cities scheduled for later this month. There's a real good chance I'll land one of those positions, but I'd really like to start over here, since the 2 men I want to have in my life are going to be here in the area. I started to reply, but then her words struck me. 2? She smiled gently. Well, besides you, Brad wants to move here after he graduates. I'd expect a call from him in the next week or 2, making sure you're all right with it. I guess your parents are driving him nuts even at college, and he's looking to make a new start of things as well. Damn it, I said, shaking my head. Won't they ever learn? I wish I could figure out a way to back them off, but they just won't stop. I'm sorry for Brad too, she said softly. He shouldn't have to go through this either. As for your parents, I believe Karen still talks with them daily. Good, I chuckled. Maybe they'll adopt her. That's a very scary thought. Kathy laughed. I felt my heart skip at the sound of her laughter. It reminded me of much better days, days when the anger and hurt weren't so strong. Billy, I'm not looking for any guarantees or promises. Well, that's not exactly true. It would be more accurate to say I don't expect any promises or guarantees. What I'm looking for is a chance to start again. I really want to do that with you as a part of it, even if it's a small part. Well, she said, taking a deep breath. What are your feelings on my proposal? I noticed she asked about my feelings and not my thoughts. That was probably smart. My thoughts were all over the place. I was both perturbed and flattered. She wanted to move close to me. In a small way, I felt like I was being manipulated into making a decision. In another way, I felt like I was being given another chance. I hadn't started out trying to remove Kathy from my life. It was more in response to the situation and to all the pressure I'd felt at the time. Back then I needed to separate myself completely from her, and it escalated into something unyielding. Now that pressure was gone. Nobody was pulling the strings but me. There were still feelings of hurt and betrayal, but they weren't as overwhelming as they'd been years ago. I also knew I did not love her anymore, and my trust was deeply damaged. Could it be rebuilt? Possibly, but it would take time and would never be what it was before. My decision was simple. The only way to find out was to give both possibilities a try. I'd continue to date other women. As for Kathy, no, it was not going to happen. If I ever start again with her, I would never know how long would that last. She has the ghost of our past marriage to deal with, and that'll never entirely go away. Will I ever marry again? Never. Dating Kathy or Celia or Lori or even someone else still sounds good to me. Marriage, not so much. With both a broken marriage and engagement in my past, I doubt I'd ever be interested in marriage again. 3 months later, just as I thought, Kathy's attempts failed miserably. I went out on a date with her, but I found that we had nothing in common. The woman I got married to was lost in time. We sat there with barely any communications. We just went out, ate our food, and just went back to our place. When we reached our place, she invited me in. I stood at the door, and the only thing I was able to say was, "Kathy, I don't think this will ever work. I went on this date with you, but I think we both have moved on, and I guess we have become different people. I am not the person you loved, and I now barely know you. So, let's stop chasing this dream that everyone is so obsessed about. Have a good night." 2 weeks later, I moved to Alaska. I had to leave my job and find a new one. The salary is less, but I guess I can make ends meet. Damn, it's cold here. Moving here, the only thing on my mind was that I wanted a clean slate. I just wanted to live. I am not dating anymore. It's hard to find women here, but I have 2 lovely Alaskan Malamutes for company. My parents are still trying to find me, but I guess the Grim Reaper will find them before they find me. Dear listeners, please share your thoughts in the comments section below, and don't forget to like, share, and subscribe.